tener a Vivian Gornick en la universidad, en Filuni, es uno de los momentos, pues yo diré climáticos de estos 6 días de feria, pero también para nosotras es un momento emblemático, porque la hemos leído desde hace tiempo. Tengo mi libro y ya vi sus extraños. Y sé que hay otros más, pero voy a dejar para que quienes no la han leído todavía corran a comprar sus libros, que son extraordinarios. Voy a dar una pequeña introducción simplemente. Bueno, I'll wait a little bit. Voy a dar un pequeño contexto muy leve. Después vamos a escuchar a Vivian Gornick hablar sobre literatura, memoria, rescate de todo esto que tanto nos importa en la pospandemia. Bueno, Vivian Gornick era ya conocida como una voz muy poderosa en esa segunda ola feminista de los años 70. Ese feminismo que surgió en Estados Unidos tras la huelga por la equidad el 26 de agosto de 1970, con el Women's League, que exigía abortos legales, centros de cuidado infantil y libertad sexual. Una segunda ola que tras la inicial de los 60 se planteaba que había muchas formas de ser mujer. Y esto era un pensamiento insólito para la época. Como periodista, su postura hipercrítica estuvo, sin embargo, lejos de los dogmatismos y del Estado. Hasta la fecha, la corrección política y la cultura de la cancelación van contra cualquier idea de verdadera libertad, y la libertad es el pulmón de la literatura, y lo que ella hace es literatura. Ficción, autoficción, ficción memorialística, ¿qué importa cómo se llame? Lo que antes, cuando escribía en The Village Voice, tenía otro nombre. Lo que Gornick escribe, respira, porque hace de lo político algo personal, y porque el análisis del mundo y lo que nos ocurre atravesó desde el principio el cuerpo y estuvo narrado por el yo. No le importó que eso fuera tildado de subjetivo décadas atrás, que no fuera la moda, porque el feminismo de los años 70 le dio un punto de vista original y nuevo, donde podía situarse en un marco existencial y filosófico más amplio. Es decir, que descubrió que la condición de mujer es emblemática de algo que afecta al conjunto de la condición humana. Entre otras cosas, es entender las luchas de poder que rigen la vida. Ahora, años después, Vivian es de pronto aclamada por propios y extraños por su libro Apegos Feroces, un libro delicioso y sorprendente, un recorrido distanciado y mordaz sobre una vida a través de recuerdos de la infancia y conversaciones con una madre atípica. Suerte de memorias sin concesiones, con un tratamiento inmisericorde hacia las relaciones de poder, y entre ellas el conflicto de poder por excelencia, la relación madre e hija. Vivian, o más bien dicho la narradora de Apegos Feroces, atraviesa la disyuntiva entre ser como la madre, o más bien no ser nunca como la madre, o ser como la vecina, Betty, una mujer que recibe a distintos hombres en su casa y vive una vida más laxa que aquella donde nos exigimos todo el tiempo. Pero además de las discusiones tan vívidas que han hecho de este libro de Gornick una obra con la que todas nos identificamos y un fenómeno de ventas que la ha llevado a viajar por todo el mundo, Vivian habla también de la asfixiante vida académica, de los problemas económicos de quien escribe, de las relaciones con los hombres. 2 veces separada, ha dicho públicamente que estar sola es una postura política. Apegos Feroces fue publicada originalmente en los 80 y de pronto fue traducida a 13 lenguas y aclamada por la crítica y los lectores desde hace unos 4 años más o menos. Cuando yo la tuve en mis manos, en la edición publicada en Sexto Piso, sin haber oído nunca de su autora y sin pensar que hoy la conocería. Sentí una sacudida, como de quien ha descubierto por casualidad un contacto y ha metido los dedos mojados en el enchufe. Enseguida quise recomendar el libro a propios y extraños y tuiteé varias impresiones. Veo que ahora muchos lo han hecho también, Julia, muy reciente. Enseguida quise recomendar el libro. Recuerdo que en un tuit puse escribir así, ¿qué más? Y la cité, con la fotografía de la portada. Y Mary Glantz, esa otra gran escritora y tuitera, contestó: tendrías que ser judía, neoyorquina y haber tenido su vida. Pues sí y pues no. Esa es la magia de la literatura. En 1987, luego de la publicación de Apegos Feroces, Vivian confiesa que no sabía muy bien qué hacer con su vida. Como su libro fue tan comentado en la edición en inglés, las traducciones llegarían, como he dicho, hasta tiempos recientes, se sintió tan satisfecha como confundida. Antes de ese libro, Vivian pasaba un semestre en alguna ciudad universitaria de Estados Unidos como profesora de escritura creativa y lo odiaba. Eso me dice. Odiaba lo estático que era todo. La gente llegaba, hacía amigos y enemigos y así podía pasar 30 años. En la academia nunca cambiaba nada. Sigo citando. Así que pensé en escribir un libro que alternara ese tipo de historias con otras en las que yo, una mujer de mediana edad, feminista radical y divorciada, me lanzaba a patear las calles de una gran ciudad. La ciudad era todo cuanto necesitaba. Me daba y me da algo fundamental que ninguna persona puede darme. Las personas son reemplazables, la ciudad no. ¡Sas! Ahí está otra vez. Se nos dice, es insobornable y no hace concesiones. Quizá yo no podía escribir un libro así, pero podía vivir en él mientras leía, aunque la lectura tarde o temprano se terminaría. Por eso me dediqué a buscar de inmediato otro libro de esta autora. Le escribí a Eduardo Rabasa de Sexto Piso y me dijo que justamente habían traducido y publicado otro libro titulado La mujer singular y la ciudad, que también les recomiendo muchísimo. En cierta forma, esta es una continuación de la anterior. La flaneur, que conversa mientras camina, en este caso con su amigo de más de 20 años, Bernard, un hombre que vive su propia infelicidad con sofisticación y que la ha ayudado a comprender la misteriosa naturaleza de las relaciones humanas más que ninguna otra relación íntima que ella haya tenido. Igual que en su primer libro, como dijo su editor, como lectores no sabemos de qué va, solo sabemos que queremos seguir caminando al lado de ella y que el libro no termina. Sobre la mujer singular y la ciudad, Vivian explica que el título responde a un libro de George Kissing que la interpeló de forma muy directa. Dice Vivian, a finales del siglo XIX, hombres de genio literario escribieron libros fantásticos sobre mujeres en la época moderna. En menos de 20 años aparecieron Jude the Obscure, de Thomas Hardy, Retrato de una dama, de Henry James, Diana de Crossways, de George Vernon. Pero por muy inteligentes que fueran estas novelas, The Odd Women de Kissing fue la que la hizo escuchar a los personajes como si se tratara de hombres y mujeres que ella conocía. Incluso la hizo reconocerse como una de las mujeres singulares. Fue traducida así, ¿no? Como la mujer singular en la ciudad, pero fíjense que Odd Women tiene otras traducciones, ¿no? Porque Odd Women puede traducirse como mujeres raras, mujeres sin pareja, mujeres atípicas, básicamente. La estructura de ese libro es el paseo. La mujer singular camina por Manhattan y mientras lo hace se encuentra con los extravagantes personajes que la habitan, de modo muy relevante sus mendigos, sus hombres. Los mendigos neoyorquinos son distintos de los de otros lados. Interpelan en voz alta a los transeúntes, no se contentan con limosnas, niegan el paso, exigen más que dinero, exigen conversaciones. Como me dijo Vivian hace un momento, exigen ser mirados, interpelados, exigen un trato humano. En cierta forma, son como los antiguos bufones de la corte, inadecuados, impertinentes, y están ahí como visionarios de otra realidad, obligando a quien se cruza en su camino a ver el otro lado de la vida. Desde luego, el lado que nos saca de nuestra zona de confort y nuestras certezas. Vivian tiene otro libro que me dice que salió ya hace un par de años, no lo he leído, se llama Unfinished Business, Notes of a Prolific Reader. Es un libro que yo deseo leer muchísimo, pues en él ella retoma su faceta de crítica literaria y hace un balance de lecturas, las lecturas que más la han marcado. Uno aprende a leer leyendo a otros, a otras, pero también leyendo el modo en que han sido leídos por otras. Cada lectura de una crítica que admiras, y aquí quiero aclarar que no me refiero a esa crítica que se ostenta como la encargada de repartir certificados de validez o nulidad tan típica de nuestro país, sino esa otra, es una puerta de acceso a otras lecturas. La crítica, la verdadera, como decía Alfonso Reyes, también impone y abre puertas. Termino ya casi. Feminista confesa y gran celebrante de la participación cada vez más poderosa de las mujeres, crítica literaria, flaneur, observadora imparcial del devenir del tiempo. Vivian Gornick fue reportera de New York Times, The Nation, The Atlantic y del legendario semanario The Village Voice, como ya he dicho, y en él cubrió los 70, el movimiento feminista, y desde allí escribió sobre el control dominador y sobre los errores del feminismo dogmático. Desde el principio, dice Vivian en una entrevista, hace 40 años, me levantaba y decía lo que me parecía mal si sentía que muchas teníamos tanta culpa como los hombres a los que señalábamos. Y explicaba que no estaba en el negocio de odiar a los hombres. Esto también suena radical ahora, en los tiempos del nicho. Pero ella responde, hoy mucha gente no se atreve, pero yo sigo diciendo y escribiendo lo que quiero. El campo está minado, pero hay que hablar. Así que para hablar está aquí Vivian Gornick. Démosle un fuerte aplauso.
That's a hard act to follow. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rosa. Thank you, all of you, for such a warm welcome. I am going to speak to you today, not about feminism, but about what I do as a writer, about memoir writing and essay writing. I grew up, like almost everybody else my age, if you wanted to be a writer, you thought of becoming a novelist. Everyone my age was going to write a great American novel. Great novel of whatever country you're in. And I grew up wanting to write one also. But I found that I couldn't. I did not have the dramatic gift for making a story that grew out of the imagination, out of whole cloth. I could not make such a story that felt life on a page. So I was stuck as a writer, and I became a journalist and worked as a journalist for many years. And then one day, when the women's movement was in full swing, I was taking a walk with a woman I knew, and she asked me a question which led me to tell a story that I had told for years as a young woman about my mother and myself and a woman who lived next door to us when I was a child. She listened, and I had always thought I would make that story into a novel. She listened to what I had to say, and she suddenly said, "That's a memoir." And none of us, certainly not me, ever thought of writing a memoir. But when she said that, it suddenly, like a light went on in my head, and I thought, yes, that I think is what I can do. Also, I realized that the story would turn on me and my mother, And that was not considered good material for a novel. But for a memoir, it was feasible, it was possible. And so I sat down in the goodness of time and wrote Fierce Attachments. And discovered shortly that many people were writing a memoir. Why were we all writing memoirs? What was the history of this? Why? Well, how did this change? Certainly not just for women, but although we were part of a triple liberationist movement that was taking place, blacks, gays, and women. These were the liberationist movements of the 70s and the 80s. And they all turned on personal testament. We were all, everybody in those groups, we were all standing up suddenly and saying to the world, we are not as you have described us. We are now going to tell you how it feels to be us. And everyone was writing a memoir. And then you began to think, what is the history of this? It certainly didn't begin with us. Why was it natural to us to want to tell the story of our lives this way? And I began to think about it, and I began to realize that memoir writing, at least in our time, had begun with the end of the Second World War. That war was so powerful and so overwhelming an event in Western civilization that what came out of it was a huge amount of testament. It was as if it was too big to be dramatized. It was too big to be given a fictional account. The actual account, the real life account, was more than enough. And so we began to live in a time when personal testament began to sound more real, more powerful, more consequential than fiction. And this is where we are, in my view. So I've been writing the personal narrative since I started writing, since I wrote Fierce Attachments, and that's more than 30 years now. And I've thought a lot about what it takes to write a memoir, what's involved in it, what is necessary for it, if you want to attempt to make literature out of a personal story, what is required. And eventually I wrote a book called The Situation of the Story, The Art, and the subtitle is The Art of Personal Narrative. And I'm going to read to you from that book now. And what I'm going to read will describe to you exactly what I mean by what it takes to write a memoir. Okay. All right. The writing you call personal narrative is written by people who, in essence, are imagining only themselves in relation to a subject at hand. Out of the raw material of a writer's own everyday life, a narrative is fashioned whose existence on the page is integral to the tale being told. This narrative becomes a persona. Its tone of voice, its angle of vision, the rhythm of its sentences, what it selects to observe and what to ignore, are chosen to serve the subject. Yet at the same time, the way the narrator or the persona sees things is to the largest degree the subject itself. When I say subject, I mean that when you tell a story, when you write a memoir, it is organized around a principle that has an object in mind. In other words, I write a memoir in relation to an idea, and I organize the material around that idea. And that is what I'm calling the subject. To fashion a persona out of one's own undisguised self is no easy thing. A novel or a poem provides invented characters or speaking voices that act as surrogates for the writer. Into these surrogates will be poured all that the novelist or the poet cannot address directly. Inappropriate longings, defensive embarrassments, antisocial desires, but must address to achieve felt reality. The persona in a nonfiction narrative is an unsurrogated one. In other words, there are no substitutes. The narrator is the writer, him or herself, not an invented character. Here, the writer must identify openly with those very same defenses and embarrassments that the novelist or the poet is once removed from. This narrator has the monumental task of transforming low-level self-interest into the kind of detached empathy required of a piece of writing that is to be of value to the disinterested reader. Yet the creation of such a persona is vital in a memoir. It is the instrument of illumination. Without it, there is neither subject nor story. To achieve it, the writer of memoir undergoes an apprenticeship as soul-searching as any undergone by a novelist or a poet. The twin struggle is to know not only why one is speaking, but who is speaking. I began my own working life in the 1970s as a writer of what was then called personal journalism, a hybrid term meaning part personal essay, part social criticism. On the barricades for radical feminism, as I was then, it had seemed natural to me from the moment I sat down at the typewriter, that's how old I am, to use myself. That is, to use my own response to a circumstance or an event as a means of making some larger sense of things. At the time, of course, that was a shared instinct. Many other writers felt similarly compelled. The personal had become political, and the headlines were metaphorical. We all felt implicated. We all felt that immediate experience signified. This was the 1970s. Wherever a writer looked, there was a personal narrative to be drawn from the political tale being told on a march, at a party, during a chance encounter. Three journalists who did it brilliantly during those years were Joan Didion, Tom Wolfe, and Norman Mailer. This was personal journalism at its height, at its really best. From the beginning, I saw the dangers of this kind of writing, saw what remarkable focus it would take to maintain the right balance between me and the story. Personal journalism had already thrown up many examples of people rushing into print with no clear idea of the relation between the narrator and the subject. Writers were repeatedly falling into the pit of confessionalism, or therapy on the page, or naked self-absorption. I don't know how well or how consistently I practiced what I had begun to preach to myself, but invariably I took it as my task to keep the narrating self subordinated to the idea in hand. In other words, the story was never to be about me. I was to use myself to illuminate the story. I knew that I was never to tell an anecdote, fashion a description, indulge in speculation whose point turned on me. I was to use myself only to clarify the argument, develop the analysis, push the story forward. I thought my grasp of the situation accurate and my self-consciousness sufficient. The reliable reporter in me would guarantee the trustworthy narrator. One day, a book editor approached me with an idea that struck a note of response. I had confided in her the tale of an intimate friendship I'd made with an Egyptian whose childhood in Cairo had strongly resembled my own in the Bronx. The resemblance had induced an ardent curiosity about them. And now I was being invited to go to Egypt to write about middle-class Cairenes. I said yes with easy pleasure, assuming that I would do in Cairo what I had been doing in New York. That is, I put myself down in the middle of the city, meet the people, use my own fears and prejudices to let them become themselves, and then I'd make something up. But Cairo was not New York, and personal journalism seemed not exactly the right job description. The city was a bombardment of stimuli, dusty, crowded, noisy, alive, and entertaining. And the people, dark, nervous, intelligent. ignorant, volatile, greedy, familiar, somehow very familiar. After all, how far from the idiom of excitable ghetto Jews, where I come from, was that of urban Muslims. The familiarity was extraordinary for me, and in the end it was my downfall. It excited me and it confused me. I fell in love with it and I romanticized it. I made a mystery out of the atmosphere and of myself in it. But when one makes a romance out of not knowing, not understanding, finding something mysterious, the reliable reporter is in danger of becoming the untrustworthy narrator. And to a large degree, that is what happened to me. I spent 6 hard-working months in Cairo. Morning, noon, and night, I was out with Egyptians, doctors, housewives, journalists, students, lawyers, guides, friends, neighbors, lovers. It seemed to me that there was no more interesting thing in the world to do than to hang out with these people who spoke passionately, spoke with intensity, were easily agitated, and seemed consumed with a nervous tenderness applied to themselves and to one another. I thought their condition profound, and I identified with it. Instead of analyzing my subject, I merged with my subject. The Egyptians were in love with their own anxiety. They thought it made them poetic. And I got right into it with them. I thought it made them poetic too. Anecdote after anecdote collected in my notes, each one easily suffused with the fever of daily life in Cairo. Merely to reproduce it, I thought, would be to tell a story. But I was wrong. On the one hand, the prose of the book that I actually produced is an amazement of energy, crowded with description and response. On the other hand, the writing is awful. The sentences are often rhetorical, the tone ejaculatory, the syntax overloaded. Where one adjective will do, 3 are sure to appear. Where quiet would be useful, agitation fills the page. My book does this curious thing. It mimics Egypt itself. That is its strength and its terrible limitation. It seemed to me for a long time that the problem had been detachment. I hadn't had any, hadn't even known it was a thing worth to be prized, that in fact without detachment, there can be no story. Description and response, yes, but no story. Even so, the confusion went deeper. When I had been a working journalist, politics had provided me with a situation. And the polemics, my polemics as a radical feminist, had given me my story. Now in Egypt, I was in free fall, confused by a kind of writing whose requirements I did not understand, but whose power I felt jerked around by. It wasn't personal journalism I was trying to write. It was personal narrative, and I didn't understand the difference between the two. It would be years before I sat down at the desk with sufficient command of distinction to control the material. That is, to serve the situation and tell the kind of story I now wanted to tell. Every work of literature has both a situation and a story. The situation is the context or circumstance, sometimes the plot. The story is the emotional experience that preoccupies the writer, the insight, the wisdom, the thing one has come to say. St. Augustine's Confessions are a perfect example of what I'm talking about. They are, in fact, something of a plot. In it, Augustine tells the tale of his conversion to Christianity. That's the situation. In the tale, he moves from an inchoate sense of being to a coherent sense of being. From an idling existence to a purposeful one. From a state of ignorance to one of truth. That's the story. Inevitably, it's a story of self-discovery and self-definition. The subject of autobiography is always self-definition, but it cannot be self-definition in the void. The memoirs, like the poet and the novelist, must engage with the world. Because engagement makes experience, experience makes wisdom, and finally it's the wisdom, or rather the movement toward it, that counts. Good writing has two characteristics, a gifted teacher of writing once said. It's alive on the page, and the reader is persuaded that the writer is on a voyage of discovery. The poet, the novelist, the memoirs, all must convince the reader they have some wisdom and are writing as honestly as possible to arrive at what they know. To the bargain, the writer and personal narrator must also persuade the reader that the narrator is reliable. In fiction, a narrator may be, and often famously is, unreliable. In nonfiction, never. In nonfiction, the reader must believe that the narrator is speaking truth. Invariably, of nonfiction it is asked, is this narrator trustworthy? Can I believe what he or she is telling me? How do nonfiction narrators make themselves trustworthy? A question perhaps best answered by example. Now I turn to an example by the English writer George Orwell. Orwell famously got out of university in the 1930s and didn't know what to do with himself, so he went to work as a member of the militia police in colonial Burma. This was 1937. He was a young Englishman, he knew nothing about the world. He gets to Burma, and he's shocked, and he thinks he's a liberal. He always thought he was against empire, he was an enemy of empire. But he gets to Burma, and he sees the situation is a lot more complicated. The Burmans, of course, hate their English masters, but do not have the courage of open revolution. So in every secret, cunning way, they make themselves the enemy of the colonial. And he is now the colonial. So this is his experience. And this is from a very famous essay called Shitty and Elephant, in which he really tells you what it means to be locked into empire as well as out of it. So he says, in Moulmein, in Lower Burma, I was hated by large numbers of people. The only time in my life that I've been important enough for this to happen to me. I was a subdivisional police officer at the top of the town, and in an aimless, petty kind of way, anti-European feeling was very bitter. As a police officer, I was an obvious target and was baited whenever it seemed safe to do so. When a nimble Burman tripped me up on a football field, and the referee, another Burman, looked the other way, the crowd yelled with hideous laughter. This happened more than once. In the end, the sneering yellow faces of young men that met me everywhere, the insults hooted after me when I was at a safe distance, got badly on my nerves. The young Buddhist priests were the worst of all. There were several thousands of them in the town, and none of them seemed to have anything to do except stand on street corners and jeer at Europeans. All this was perplexing and upsetting, for at that time I had already made up my mind that imperialism was an evil thing, and the sooner I left my job, the better. But he was young and could get nothing into perspective, and ill-educated, and had to think my problems out in utter silence. And that's the kind of silence that's imposed on every Englishman in the East. I did not even know that the British Empire was dying. All I knew was that I was stuck between my hatred of the empire I served and my rage against the evil-spirited little beasts who tried to make my job impossible. With one part of my mind, I thought of the British Raj as an unbreakable tyranny, as something clamped down upon the will of prostrate peoples. With another part, I thought that the greatest joy in the world would be to drive a bayonet into a Buddhist priest's stomach. Feelings like these are the normal byproducts of imperialism. Ask any Anglo-Indian official if you catch them off duty. The man who speaks these sentences in the story being told is a civilized man made murderous by the situation he finds himself in. We believe this about him because the writing makes us believe it. Paragraph upon paragraph, composed in almost equal part of narration, commentary, and analysis, attests to a reflective nature now regarding its own angry passions with a visceral but contained distaste. And it's this that makes the writing so strong. He is in a rage, but the writing is not in rage. He is depressed, but the writing is not depressed. He is feeling murderous, but the writing is not murderous. This man became, this narrator, is the persona that Orwell pulled out of himself to write that story. This man became the Orwell persona in countless books and essays. He is the involuntary truth speaker, the one who implicates himself, not because he wants to, but because he has to. He has no choice. If he's to tell the truth, that truth has to be as complicated as he has just made it. On the one hand, he knows imperialism is evil. On the other hand, he wants to send a bayonet into the guts of the Burmese priest who makes his life hell. He is the narrator created to demonstrate the dehumanizing effect of empire on all within its reach. His presence alone, I am the man, I was there, that alone is an indictment. It was the politics of his own time that Orwell was after. That was the situation into which he interjected this persona, the one who alone could tell the story he wanted told. Orwell himself, the man, the writer himself, just as I am sitting here, Vivian Gornick, the writer herself. In actuality, he was supposedly a man often at the mercy of his own mean insecurities. In other words, he was rotten. In his life, he could act and sound ugly. The revisionist biographies now have him not only a sexist and an obsessed anti-communist, but possibly an informer as well. Yet the persona he created in his nonfiction is an essence of democratic decency. That was something genuine that he pulled from himself. This George Orwell is a wholly successful fusion of experience, perspective, and personality that is fully present on the page. Because he is so present, we feel that we know who is speaking. See, that's what I mean. The ability to make us believe that we know who is speaking is the trustworthy narrator achieved. One of the most interesting memoirists of our time is another Englishman, a man named J.R. Ackerley. When Ackerley died in 1967 at the age of 71, he left behind a remarkable piece of confessional writing he'd been working on for the better part of 30 years. It is ostensibly a tale of family life. He was the son of Roger Ackerley, a fruit merchant in London. His father was a large, easygoing, generous man, at once expansive and kindly, but indirect in his manner, very indirect. Ackerley himself grew up to become literary and homosexual, absorbed by his own interests and secrets, given to hiding his real life from the family. After his father's death in 1929, Ackerley learned that Roger, the father, had lived a double life. All the time the Ackerleys were growing up in middle-class comfort in a suburb of London, the father was keeping a second family on the other side of town, a mistress and 3 daughters. The disclosure of this second life, as the Victorian, what the Victorians call secret orchard, the discovery of this secret orchard, as the Victorian euphemism had it, astounded Ackerley, the writer, to such a degree that he became obsessed with probing deeper into the obscurity of his father's beginnings. In time, he became convinced that in his youth, father had been a male whore, and that it was through the love of a wealthy man that he had gained his original stake in life. This is the story J.R. Ackley set out to tell. Why did it take him 30 years to tell it? Why not 3? Because what I told you was not his story. It was his situation. It was the story that took 30 years to get itself told. Ackley was, he thought, only putting together a puzzle of family life. All I have to do, he said to himself, is get the sequence right and the details correct, and everything will fall into place. But nothing fell into place. After a while, he thought, I'm not describing a presence, I'm describing an absence. This is the tale of an unlived relationship between himself and his father. Who was he? Who was I? Why did we keep missing each other? After another while, he realized, I always thought my father didn't want to know me. Now I see, I didn't want to know me. I didn't want to know him, and I didn't want to know me. My Father and Myself, the name of the book, is a little more than 200 pages in length. Its prose is simple and lucid, wonderfully inviting from the first, now famous sentence. Here's the sentence. I was born in 1896, and my parents were married in 1919. The voice that speaks that sentence will address with grace and candor whatever it is necessary to examine. From it will flow strong feeling and vivid intelligence, original phrasing, and a remarkable directness. It's the directness that dazzles, coming as it does, and this is a minor miracle, from the exactly right distance, not too close, not too far. At this distance, everyone and everything is made understandable, and therefore interesting. When a writer can make everyone's position understandable, not approved of, not rejoiced in, not heroized, just understandable, which is what I struggled to do with my mother and Letty in that book that I wrote, Fierce Detectives. It was my aim just to make everyone understandable, so that, that was sufficient sympathy. That I thought was my job as a persona, as a nonfiction persona. Because everyone and everything in Ackley's book is interesting, we believe that the narrator is telling us all that he knows, which doesn't mean that he has the truth. It just means he's trying to get to the truth. That's the reliable narrator. You have to feel that the writer is trying to arrive at the truth, not necessarily they have reached it. My trip to Egypt and the book that emerged from it now seem to me an embodiment of my own struggle to clarify, to release from anxiety the narrator who could serve the situation and find the story, a thing I was not then able to do. It was a time when my own psychological wishes were so mixed as to make it impossible for that instinct to be obeyed. I wanted at once both to clarify, like a young woman, I wanted at once both to clarify and to mystify. I was never sure who was telling the story, and as a result, I never had a story. A dozen years after Egypt, I set out to write a memoir about my mother, myself, and a woman who lived next door to me when I was a child. Here, for the first time, I struggled to isolate the story from the situation. Here, I taught myself what a persona is, and here I began to figure out what they all had to do with one another. This story, the one about my mother, myself, and the woman next door, was based on an early insight I had. These two women between them had made me a woman. Each had been widowed young, each had fallen into despair. One devoted the rest of her life to the worship of lost love. The other became the whore of Babylon. No matter. In each case, the lesson being taught was that a man was the most important thing in a woman's life. I hated the lesson from early on, and resolved to get out and leave both it and the women behind. I did get out, but as time went on, I discovered that I couldn't leave any of it behind, especially not the women, especially not my mother. I had determined to separate myself from her theatrical self-absorption, but now, as the years accumulated, I saw that my own hot-tempered and cutting ways were indeed only another version of her meaty dramatics. I saw further that for both of us, the self-dramatization was a substitute for action, a piece of unresolved raging in me as well as her. It flashed on me that I could not leave my mother because I had become my mother. This was the story I wanted to tell without sentiment or cynicism, the one I thought justified speaking hard truth. The fraction inside I had that I could not leave my mother because I'd become my mother was my wisdom. A tale of psychological environment I wanted badly to trace out. To tell that tale, I soon discovered I had to find the right tone of voice. The one I habitually lived with wouldn't do it all. My everyday world voice. It whined, it grated, it accused, especially it accused. Then there was the matter of syntax. My own ordinary everyday sentence, fragmented, interjecting, overriding. That also wouldn't do. It had to be altered, modified, brought under control. And then I could see, this, as soon as I began writing, that I needed to pull back, way back, from these people and these events to find the place where the story could draw a deep breath and take its own measure. In short, a useful point of view, one that would permit greater freedom of association, for that, of course, is what I've been describing, had to be brought along. What I didn't see, and for a long while, was that this point of view could only emerge from a narrator who was both me and not me at the same time. That is, I was many things. I was a divorced middle-aged feminist walking the streets of a great city. I was an academic. I was a journalist. I was a friend. I was a sister. I was many things. But the one thing that I had to become on the page was the narrator who could not leave her mother because she had become her mother. That was the person in me who was going to tell the story and had to be told. If I was any of these other people, I'd lose it. But if I concentrated on that, making myself that person on the page, I had fierce attachments. And that is exactly what happened. And the rest is history. Later, reading and rereading other memoirs, I went into a trance of recognition from which I don't think I ever emerged. I could see that their writing was about something in very much the same way that mine was. In each case, the writer was possessed of an insight that organized the writing, and in each case, a persona had been created to serve the insight. I became enraptured, tracing out the development of the persona in memoir, memoir after memoir. And it was out of this rapture that I realized I was a nonfiction writer. Living as I now did, with the idea of the nonfiction persona, I began to think better than I had before about the commonplace need alive in all of us to make large sense of things in the very moment, even as experience is overtaking us. Everywhere I turned in those days, I found an excuse for the observation that we pull from ourselves the narrative who would shape better than we alone can the inchoate flow of event into which we are continually being plunged. I remember once my then husband and I and a friend of ours went on a rafting trip down the Rio Grande. The river was hot and wild, sad, brilliant, remote, closed in by canyon walls, desert banks, snakes, and flash floods. On one side, Texas, on the other, Mexico. A week after we'd been there, snipers on the Mexico side killed 2 people, also floating on a raft. Later, we each wrote about the trip. My husband, my friend, and I. My husband focused brightly on the river rats, on the river rats who were our guides. Our friend, soberly, on the misery of illegal immigration. I, morbidly, on what strangers my husband and I had become. Reading these pieces side by side was in itself an experience. We had all used the river, the heat, the remoteness to frame our stories. Beyond that, how alone each of us had been, sitting there side by side on that raft, carving out of our separating anxieties the narrator who, in the midst of all that beauty and impressiveness, would keep us company and tell us what we were living through. I began to see that in the course of daily life, when by my own lights I act badly, confrontational, challenging, or dismissive, I am out there on that raft before I have found the narrator who can bring into control the rushing onslaught of my own internal flux. When I am doing better, I am able to see that the flux is a situation. I stop turning around inside my own defensiveness. I adopt a tone, a syntax, a perspective, not wholly mine, that allows me to focus on what? The husband, the guides, the illegals, no matter. Any one of them will do. I become interested then in my own existence only as a means of penetrating the situation in hand. I have created a persona who can find the story riding the tide that I, in my unmediated state, am otherwise going to drown.
Muchísimas gracias, Vivian Gornick, ven porque la tienen que leer. Aparentemente es simple, en realidad es profundísima, está dando una técnica, está hablando de distancia narrativa, punto de vista, está cambiando la idea convencional que tenemos acerca de lo que es una historia, porque está hablando de que la historia es el flujo y de cuándo consigues realmente estar escribiendo literatura y no simplemente digamos, anotando datos que observas. Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Vivian. It was such a pleasure having you here and giving us this writing lesson. So interesting. So, corramos a comprar los libros de Vivian y mientras ella esté en la feria, obtengan su firma. Si son fetichistas, como soy yo, eso le añade valor al libro. Muchas gracias por haber